Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to our webinar for the Draft Housing and Business Choice Plan Change. My name is Katie McRae. I'm Head of Communications and Engagement at Council. Look, thanks very much for taking part in this event. Webinars are a new avenue of engagement for us, not only because of the COVID impacts, but also because we want to offer residents more ways to engage with us, and hopefully we can connect with more people. But because this is a new forum for our team, please be with us if there are a few bumps in the session. So a bit of an agenda tonight. We're going to take you through the proposed residential and business choice plan change, specifically proposed commercial controls. But first I'd like to introduce the teams behind the scene and let you know how you can participate even though your mics and cameras are turned off. Then I'll hand over to our planners who'll explain the proposed changes and why these are happening. So tonight you're going to be hearing from Emily and David, who are our subject matter experts. And we also have a team working hard behind the scenes to keep the session moving smoothly. So I'll just get Emily and David to pop up on there so you can see who you're talking to. Thank you very much for your questions supplied during the registration. We'll be popping up those answers in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen and on Slido. So your mics and cameras are switched off so we can keep the session moving, but there are several ways you can ask questions as this webinar proceeds. So our preferred method is Slido, and if you go to the website slido.com, you can, on your mobile or web browser, and enter in the code that you see there on screen. That's 894528. When prompted, you'll be directed to the Q&A screen. You can just type in your question there and the box labelled type in your question. Once you've typed it in, the moderator will respond to it with either an answer or will be answering it verbally as part of this webinar. If you prefer not to use Slido, there are another two ways that you can ask questions during the webinar. If you've got the Microsoft Teams app, you can use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the top of your screen along the top banner there. Once you click on it, it'll appear on the right-hand side of your screen. If you don't have the Microsoft Teams app, you can email us at engagement@ccc.govt.nz, and we'll be monitoring this inbox throughout the presentation. The team will be keeping an eye out for your questions, and you'll be able to see them answered in the chat on the right of your screen and in Slido. And we're also going to be taking question breaks throughout the presentation, so if you're busy listening, you don't need to try to type at the same time. If you're on the app, you can also react, thumbs up, thumbs down to some of the questions and answers in the chat section. You can also use the reactions tab at the top of your screen to respond to what's being said during the presentation. If you're having any trouble hearing, or if you're experiencing sound issues, you can turn on live captions. Just click on those three small dots that appear above the top of your screen and go to More. Click on Turn on Live Captions, which is near the bottom of the drop-down list. One last thing from me. Hopefully you've seen the banner come up to let you know that this session is being recorded. This will be made available to you and shared on our website in the next couple of days. So I'll now hand over to the team to get the presentation underway. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. So what we're talking about today is the changes that we need to make to our commercial chapters as a result of implementing the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and also the Amendment Act, which came into play in December last year. So our population is growing and changing, and we need more homes and variety. And we also need to work to consolidate our development around our commercial centres. This is an opportunity to shape how and where our city grows. So we're looking at how much development and growth do we want to offer for Christchurch through this process. Next slide. So similar to last night, you'll see there are some aspects of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and also the Amendment Act which we need to accept. They are direction that we don't have the ability to change. And there are some things though that we do have the ability to influence. So sometimes where this development occurs, there is an outcome directed. The level of intensification or the level of development provided for is something that we have some flexibility and choice on. And then what we can control. So that's our messaging to our communities and how we plan ahead, so how we plan smarter. Next slide. So the area of our urban environment is the residential zones, our commercial zones as they relate to Policy 3D, and the areas needed, so the aspects of the district plan to control, subdivision, fencing, engineering and access. Outside of scope is anything outside of our urban environment. So that urban environment includes Templeton and Littleton, but doesn't include the rest of Banks Peninsula. And so for the purposes of the commercial changes, the commercial Banks Peninsula zone is considered out of scope. And we're also not looking to do any new greenfield areas or rural zones as part of this work either, or address our non-residential activities as part of our residential zones. Next slide. So the changes to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development Policy 3D came through the Amendment Act in December last year. And previously, the direction was to intensify in areas of accessibility and or demand. The new direction is to intensify around our centres. The challenge that we face is that the direction in the revised policy 3D refers to planning standard centres, which are not centres that our district plan currently identifies. So our first step in providing that level of intensification is identifying which planning standard centres we have within the district plan. This is not an opportunity for us to revisit our centres-based hierarchy completely. This is not a centres review. This is looking at the planning standard centres and how we transfer our existing district plan framework into a planning standard framework. What we have identified working through that process is that some of our centres are appropriate to receive the height provided by MDRS, so up to 12 metres. So that is likely an increase from about 8 metres for our neighbourhood centres to 12 metres. What we are looking at for some of our larger centres, so our larger local centres, we're looking at a 200 metre radius with a height limit of 14 metres. And that's within and in proximity to those centres. And for our significant local centres, we have identified Maryvale and Sydenham, and those are getting a town centre response. So 400 metres at 20 metres in height. And for our town centres, as I said, 400 metres at 20 metres in height, and emerging metropolitan zones will be zoned town centre, but the commensurate intensification response around those centres is 600 metres at 20 metres in height. Next slide. So with regards to our centres hierarchy, largely the planning standard hierarchy, the centre zones that we have within the district plan converted quite nicely over to planning standard centres. So our local centres within the district plan become neighbourhood centres, our neighbourhood centres within the district plan become local centres, our town centres within, our district centres within the district plan become town centres. We have no equivalent metropolitan centre, and so we haven't identified that under planning standards. And then our central city business zone becomes our city centre. Next slide. So there will be some changes that we need to make to our central city zone, and Dave Haddam, who's our urban designer, will talk later on some of the detailed changes that we'll make to the standards. But broadly, what we're looking to do is identify our central city business zone as our central city zone. We're seeking to retain the road wall height at 21 metres. We're seeking an enabling framework up to 28 metres, which will retain the urban design certification currently in place for our central city zone. And then we are looking to enable heights above 28 metres with discretion related to built form and urban design. So again, that's an enabling RDA framework for anticipated heights. So we are anticipating unlimited heights in the central city zone. So above that 28 metres isn't a height threshold, that's simply a trigger where additional controls will be required because the design certification process is only up to that 28 metres that we're looking at that space. Next slide. Okay, bit of a, I'll just, next slide. Cool. Metropolitan centres is something that we have looked at quite closely. If we just go back one, Kieran. Awesome. So with regards to our metropolitan centres, so the MPSUD requires that for metropolitan centres, they have a minimum of 6 stories around them at a walkable catchment. We have provided 6 stories or 20 metres in height around some of our larger commercial centres, and the extent of that level of intensification varies depending on the scale of the centre. However, we don't consider that we have metropolitan centre zones within Christchurch. The planning standard definition for a metropolitan centre requires a broad range of commercial, community, recreational and residential activities at a sub-regional catchment level. While we recognise that some of our larger commercial retail centres have catchments that may be sub-regional in size, the definition requires more than just a commercial sub-regional focal point. So we are looking at how those centres might grow in the future. So we have recognised emerging metropolitan centres, so these are zoned town centre, but provide a commensurate intensification response around those centres to enable them to grow. We will be looking at a responsive planning framework to respond to changes, meaning they can transition over time. Next slide. So we are looking to make some changes in our commercial mixed use zone and also our city centre mixed use zone. So the city centre mixed use zone, which is within the 4 AVs and within a walkable catchment of our central city zone, we are looking to increase the height up to 32 metres to align with the high density residential framework surrounding it. And we are also looking to improve the residential controls within that zone. In the commercial mixed use zone, we are looking at some rezoning. So that's in the surrounding band along the south side of the central city, just outside the 4 AVs. At the moment, zoned industrial general. We are looking to convert that to a commercial mixed use zone. So that transition will allow for residential activities to establish, but it does not take away from the industrial general activities, which will still be able to continue under the commercial mixed use zone in that location. The reason we are proposing this area for a rezoning is to enable the the residential activities to establish in this area because of its proximity within a walkable catchment to the Sydenham centre zone and also its proximity to the central city. We have identified other areas of industrial general land in proximity to our commercial centres outside of the central city area, and we are looking to introduce a brownfield residential overlay in those locations to enable residential activity to occur. So a very similar approach, but slightly different methods to enable residential activity on those locations. Consent is still required for most residential activity, so we're not looking to change those thresholds to require consent. Next slide. Questions?
So we've got the questions coming in and the ones that were also asked as part of the registration process. So I've just got a couple of questions I'd like to put to the team here. Is there a restriction on what type of businesses will be allowed to operate with the increase in residential use?
Yes, good question. So with regards to the commercial mixed use zone, we are looking to enable industrial activities, but with regards to commercial activities, these will be limited. So we're not looking to provide for the commercial activities that you would find located in our central city, for example, medical centres and the like. This is primarily going to be industrial general activities and residential activities enabled in this land.
And another question for you there, will the rates increase in a rezoned area?
Good question. So we review our rating systems every 3 years, and there is a rating review underway, and that will be based on evaluations of land and capital value on 1st of August 2022. So these changes we're making now are unlikely to affect the rating database as of 1st of August 2022 because we're not looking to notify this plan change until 20th of August 2022. So there is some separation there between the rating review and the changes that will come online as part of this piece of work. Over time, though, it is likely that the value of that land will change, and the business uses are taken on a case-by-case basis through that rating evaluation.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so just a reminder of how you can ask questions as part of the session. So we have Slido working at the moment. You can see the details on the screen there and the code that you need to add in. You can also ask a question if you've got the Teams app via the Q&A along the top of the screen. It'll appear on the right-hand side of the page. And also just a reminder that if you would prefer, you can email us at engagement@ccc.govt.nz, and we'll be monitoring that inbox. So we might continue on with the presentation.
Hello everyone. So I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about some of the zones and how we see them working, some of the proposed controls that we might put in place. I'm going to focus mostly on the central city and on the mixed use zone because those are the zones that are going to see the most change under this framework. So I'll start by just talking briefly about our central city zone and how it works at the moment. That we weren't necessarily looking before this changes came along to make major changes to the way the zone works, but largely the rebuild has been quite successful at providing a good urban form in terms of the identifiable places that have been created and the consistent and legible urban form. Sorry, I just lost connection then. So this slide just shows some of the things that we think have been achieved, in particular the legible space, the safe, well-connected spaces, some of the courtyards that have been achieved. And we'll be looking to build on that in the changes that we're going to make. Have the next slide, please. So at the moment, in the central city, we allow for a height of 28 metres, which is about 7 or 8 stories. But there's also a road wall control, which is a lower control at the street front. The purpose of that is partly that it allows sun and avoid shading of the streets, but it's also to try and create a consistent street wall where no one building is overly dominant. And it's part of the characteristic of Christchurch that's been established, I think, that it's a low form streetscape, but it's reasonably consistent. And that's the reason we put that in is partly that it reflects a community desire for a low-rise city, but it's also a concern at the time that large amounts of development would be taken up by a few buildings and we would be left with sites that didn't recover for a long time. So in part, those concerns have now passed. And but we do think that the street wall has been quite a success in creating a consistent urban form. Next slide, please. So we identified some of the issues that can occur with taller buildings, and these can be the obvious issues like shading in public space, and the way that tall buildings built close to each other might interfere with outlook from other buildings. And the effects that buildings create are kind of multiplied with height because of the extra visibility and the effect on the wider area. And other effects include visual dominance, the prominence of blank walls. I've got an example of a picture here from Brisbane, which is a building which is about 20 stories without any features. The issue we have is that sidewalls need to be fire rated, and so there's not space for any features. Wind also becomes an issue with height because winds are faster at height and tall buildings kind of drag them down onto the street. So it's something that we'll need to think about with increased height. So the diagram I have provided is just a kind of summary of those issues. And in allowing for taller buildings, we need to think about how those will be managed. Have the next slide, please. So in order to think about those issues, what we've suggested is a revised building envelope. and that's just the area that's allowed to be filled by buildings without a consent or with a an easy consent path. And we're not planning to restrict the existing building envelope, which is that what I spoke about earlier with the 21 metres road height and the 28 metres in total. So that in the central city remains unchanged. And what we thought about is what would happen above that level. It's a fairly conventional way to manage height is to set the taller elements of the building back from the sides and the front so that we avoid the need for blank walls and create space for sun and for wind to pass in the upper levels. So that's what we're proposing, and we've put in some proposed controls in the plan change which are listed here, really about managing the height of the taller elements of the building. Next slide, please. So just out of interest, I've borrowed this slide from a study in Melbourne, which looks at building envelopes in different cities around the world. And it uses the floor area ratio. So there's an idea of what you can build on the site. And the study's done for Melbourne, and they use that as a control in managing the amount of development on a parcel. And they allow for 18:1, which means that if you've got 1,000 square meters of floor, you can have 18,000 square meters of floor space built on that site. Next slide, please. So for the sake of interest, I've added Christchurch's envelope into that. The contrast between what we're proposing in other cities is that we're not using floor area ratio as a control. And so that means that comparatively tall towers and a comparatively large amount of development will be allowed on parcels in Christchurch. In reality, we don't expect people to be building 50-storey towers, but it just shows that the way we're managing it is intended to be comparable with other cities in the world. Next slide, please. Moving on to mixed use zones now. So these are the areas that are predominantly around the fringes of the city, including the central city mixed use, which is within the 4 avenues, and the commercial mixed use zone, which sits without it. And the area that Emily was talking about earlier in Sydenham would be the commercial mixed use zone. Also includes areas of Addington, which are seeing quite a lot of change at the moment. Can I have the next slide, please? So the mixed use zones are, as we've already stated, proposed to cover a larger area. The control of residential areas. So the mixed use allows for a variety of activities. So these are often areas that were once zoned for industrial use, but the uses have been transitioned to allow for residential, and partly that's to make efficient use of the space, but it's also about allowing a mix of activities in those areas to create a kind of unique environment. So some areas will probably transition to being predominantly residential, and others will remain a mix of uses, and it kind of contributes to a series of neighbourhoods within the city. So it's has its own benefits in its own right. It's not just about changing to residential. We have started to see quite a lot of residential use of the area, though. In some areas, it is the predominant use. So the changes that we're making do include a more intensive management of the residential uses of those areas, so an MDRS style control. So allowing a certain number of units as a permitted activity, but larger residential developments would need resource consent. The development envelopes are quite permissive, more so than in the residential zone. So for instance, there's site coverage is 90%, but it's a change to what's allowed at the moment. We are looking at increased heights. That's consistent with the government direction. Around the city centre, that would be to enable 10 stories, that 32-metre height limit. We would, as for the central city zone, not be changing what you can do in the existing height envelope. So up to 17 metres the current built form standards apply with some tweaks, but over 17 metres, a similar envelope would apply with setbacks to manage the same kind of effects. And the scale of building isn't as high, so the setbacks are smaller, but the sort of the intention of the way to manage it, to manage the wind effects and the sun effects, is the same. I'll talk a little bit about resource consents. Both these envelope and that in the central city, it's intended to be a trigger point for consents to be required. So if people are looking at building a bit closer to the boundary, closer to the front, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's not permitted, but it does give us the opportunity to look at the likely impacts of that kind of development and then assess it against the framework of assessment matters. It's still a restricted discretionary consent, but it just highlights the issues that council will be looking at and tries to ensure that those are managed. And it is kind of a step up from just being a plain discretionary matter without highlighting those issues, because those are what we've identified as being as particular concern. In the case of residential development, we will bring in the residential design principles, which is what we use in the medium density zone and what we're trying to standardise across our residential zones. We're looking at having a consistent framework for the assessment of residential development, and we're also seeing that the government direction on residential development is driving the conversion of these industrial areas and more intensive residential development. Have the next slide, please. So for other commercial areas, as I sort of intimated earlier, we're not proposing many changes to these zones. That's the existing commercial core zone, which relates to the district centres, would apply in places like Riccarton and Papanui, and the neighbourhood centre zones. And the reason for that is that the scale of development that we are implementing hasn't changed greatly. So in those areas, 6 stories is current, so the commercial core areas and the district centres, 6 stories is currently allowed. That's not changing. So the changes to those zones will be minimal. And the same applies in neighbourhood centres, where the height limit may be changing from 8 to 12 metres, but the zone is already set up to deal with that scale of development. The main change there is that we're looking at again, introducing the residential design principles as the main assessment framework, for the same reason that we're looking to see more residential development there, and we're looking at maintaining the quality and consistency of our assessment of quality of development and the consistency of assessment across the city. So I think that's all I have in my urban design presentation. So if we have the next slide, we'll probably be taking questions now.
We are indeed. So I have another couple of ones that I'd like to put to the team, and this obviously is an opportunity for anyone who'd like to ask a question. Just a reminder again, we've got Slido operating, details on screen. You can use the Q&A function within the Teams app, or you can email us at engagement@ccc.govt.nz. So team, question for you here. There's a service line behind the property. Will this residential change mean a decrease in speed of trains?
Is that one for you, Emily?
Yes,
not
yeah,
for me.
I'm just thinking about that one. So we are looking to do some rezoning, and we are aware that the train line runs through along those corridors between the central city and this proposed area for rezoning. The adverse effects from, or reverse sensitivity effects from the train will be managed through the provisions that we're intending to include, and there is and that we are looking to carry through the district plan as well. So setbacks from the rail corridor and also some noise insulation components as well.
And what about, will there be any amendments to parking in the zone and in adjacent areas?
Parking, I think, is been directed again by this same legislation that we cannot have parking requirements in the district plan, so we won't be requiring any on-site parking. Parking will be managed by the council's parking policy, and that would look at the necessity for any parking management on the street as and when the issues occur. but that it's not something that's managed through the consent process.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thanks very much, Emily, David, for the presentation, and also obviously for all of the questions that have come in. Hopefully that's provided you with some good information for you to be able to provide feedback on the draft plan change, and you can do so until the 13th of May and by visiting our website. Just move the presentation on there, you'll see the details of Have Your Say, ccc.govt.nz/have your say for all the information about the plan change. There are actually 4 plan changes that you can provide feedback on: the draft housing business choice plan change and all of the qualifying matters and their associated draft plan changes. So we can see there we've got coastal hazards, heritage and draft radio communication pathways. Next slide, please.
So we are open for consultation at the moment, and we are looking for feedback on the changes that we're making to our commercial zones. This is a component that that does have some discretion, so we are interested to hear from our public on any feedback they have with regards to the conversion we've made with regard from the existing centres hierarchy in the commercial chapter of the district plan to these centres in the planning standard zones. Next slide. So with regards to the decision-making process, so we are out for consultation at the moment. Consultation closes Friday the 13th of May, so that is Friday next week. Following this, we will look and take your feedback on board that we received during this pre-consultation engagement period, and we will be looking to notify before 20th of August 2022, which is a statutory deadline. And that will be an opportunity for the public to provide formal submissions on this process. And there are components of this plan change which will have immediate legal effect. Submissions on the plan change will then be published, and that will be open for further submissions in late 2022, and then that will progress to an independent hearings panel hearing early in 2023, and then feedback from that hearings panel to council with recommendations, and then any areas where there is disagreement between council and the independent hearings panel will go to the Minister for the Environment as the final decision maker. Council will need to make its recommendations on the recommendations from the IHP before 20th of August 2023. Next slide.
So just one final opportunity to ask any questions at the end of this presentation. Just in terms of process, so we will be making a full transcript of the questions and the answers that we've received available as part of the pack, and we'll be sending you a link to all of that at the end of the presentation. So I was actually just wondering, in this final opportunity for questions, if you do have anything that you would like to ask of the team, if you'd like to raise your hand and we could take, you could put your mic on. So it looks like it's all quiet out there. Look, if we could just go to the next slide, please. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm giving up your evening to find out a little bit more about the proposed plan change and its implications. So look, while we're not able to change the government legislation, we're really keen to hear from residents about how you think our city needs to respond to the legislation and make it work for Christchurch. If you've got any feedback about your experience tonight, we'd love to hear it, and you can email us there at the engagement team. If you want to raise any issues, you have any additional questions, you can get in touch with the plan change there. There's the email there, planchange@ccc.govt.nz. So just a reminder again, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on the website along with the presentation and a transcript of the questions and answers that have been asked. So again, thank you very much from Emily, David, myself and the rest of the team. Good night.